Just a whisper through the gloom, you will find your compass pointing home.
I'd like to welcome you to Newbold and to the Newbold Bible Conference specifically. Welcome those here and those online at home. Last night they very much emphasized the importance of the topic that's being covered over the conference. I remember sitting at the feet of a noted theologian called John McDade, who pointed out that the rise in atheism might be down to the way that Christians behave when it comes to God, the way that we talk about God and relate to him. So I concur that this is a very important subject that's being covered. We are going to start, if I can invite you to stand, and Barbara is going to lead us with our first song, which is Father, Lead Me Day by Day. Let us pray. Our kind and loving Heavenly Father, thank you for who you are. Thank you for sending your Son that we may live. Thank you for sending the Spirit that we may be transformed and empowered. Thank you that we too are sent with all that means for our significance as your children. And as we interact with, relate to, and journey with others, may we do so with humility, with love, sensitivity, and compassion, in recognition of how you interact with us, relate to us, and journey with us. And in those moments where we struggle with ill health, finances, relational strife, may your presence be felt even as it is already there. May your love for us shine through even as we are caught up in the rough and tumble of life. May our present experience be informed and strengthened by who you are, both in the present and with an eye on the future, such that hope, meaning, and purpose is ours. May we praise you for all that you are, the things we understand, the things we have little or no comprehension of. May our worship infuse our hearts, minds, and souls. May every breath in and out be a moment of recognition of you as our Creator and Sustainer. I ask these things in your name. Amen. Please be seated. Our first speaker today is Dr. Kayle de Waal. Kayle is an ordained minister who currently serves as the Education Director at the Trans-European Division. Prior to this, Kayle held a number of leadership positions at Avondale University down under in Australia, and this included being the head of the theology department for a number of years. Kayle earned his PhD from the University of Auckland and has published 8 books, authored more than 30 peer-reviewed publications, and been awarded 2 research grants. I did ask each of the speakers to tell me what was surprising about them so that we can see the human behind the huge intellects on show. And Kayle informed me that he likes spicy food and laughter. I would challenge whether those are surprising, but he does enjoy an Indian meal out if anyone would like to go with him later. The title of Kayle's talk presentation is The Transformational Old Testament Context of Revelation 5:5.
Good morning. It's a joy to be with you at the Newbold Bible Conference 2023, and I look forward to being able to share a paper with you on the transformational Old Testament context of Revelation 5, verse 5. The book of Revelation is a lot like the movie Shrek. There are scenes in Shrek that draw on previous movies, particularly those made by Disney. When Donkey says, "I can fly," he's drawing from the Disney movie Peter Pan. When Donkey says, "You might have seen a horn fly, you might have seen a super fly, but you ain't never seen a donkey fly," there again, the producers are drawing from the Disney movie Dumbo. Viewers who are unfamiliar with the previous movies will not be able to grasp some of the nuances in the meaning of the movie Shrek. Shrek, in fact, then gives its informed viewers a richer experience in meaning-making. Analogously, this morning, the book of Revelation can only be understood in the light of its Old Testament background. What Disney is to Shrek, the Old Testament is to the book of Revelation. In fact, Richard Borkham suggests that the Old Testament allusions are meant to recall the Old Testament context, which thereby becomes part of the meaning the apocalypse conveys, and to build up, sometimes by a network of allusion, to the same Old Testament passage in various parts of the apocalypse, and interpretation of whole passages of Old Testament prophecy. This morning, we'll reflect on Revelation 5:5 and 6a. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Surprisingly, the Old Testament literary and thematic context of the allusions of the lion of the tribe of Judah and the root of David have not been deeply explored, and hence their interpretational value has not been mined to understand the transition from the symbol of lion to the symbol of lamb. In fact, the lacuna is so significant that English and German commentators have not explored this context. Most academic discussion around Revelation 5:5 has contended, and rightly so, that the phrase the lion of the tribe of Judah, referring to Genesis 49, verse 9, and the root of David, referring to Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 10, combine to point to messianic deliverance. Craig Kuster suggests that the lion imagery has two key meanings: power and kingship. He references a number of biblical and extra-biblical sources to bolster these claims, but provides no contextual analysis of these passages. Brian Blount has referenced, especially in relation to this idea of the root of David, a number of texts in Jeremiah and Zechariah, but again, no additional insight on how we can understand the juxtaposition of Isaiah 11:1, Isaiah 11:10 in relation to Revelation 5:5. The scholarly discussion has also focused on how we can understand the transition from symbol of lion to that of symbol of lamb in 5:6, and the impact this has on interpretation. For example, Wilfred Harrington points out the reason for the deliberate switch. He says, the lion is the lamb. The ultimate power of God is manifest on the cross. Ramsey Michael, another commentator, suggests that the lion and lamb interpret and clarify each other. The Jewish Messiah is the Christian Messiah. The triumphant lamb is, the triumphant lion is the slaughtered lamb. And so while these interpretations look back at salvation history, the analysis is based more on a theologizing of the text rather than a careful study, a careful exegesis of the text. In sum, then, while there's general agreement that John is alluding to Genesis 49:9 and Isaiah 11:1 and 10, the literary relationship between lion and lamb is very much open to debate. Moreover, the wider literary and thematic context of these Old Testament passages has not been explored, and it's our contention this morning that a deeper probe of these contexts will provide new avenues of meaning-making. And so, it is to that we now turn. The symbol of lion of the tribe of Judah points us to the story of Judah in Genesis 37 to 44, which constitutes the story of Jacob. And the story of Jacob is in fact particularly that of Joseph and is one of divine providence. Our first encounter of Judah in the Joseph story that's pertinent is in Genesis 37. The context is that Joseph has been stripped of his coat, thrown into a pit, and the brothers are sitting down to have a meal. They look up and they see some Ishmaelite traders. And the text reads, Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. Judah speaks up to keep Joseph from being killed. And while the narrator does not give us modern readers any ideas about Judah's motives, it appears he acts out of selfish reasons. The narrative takes a supposed diversion, and in view of some scholars, an irrelevant one, to focus on the illicit encounter of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. The Joseph story, of course, is picked up again in chapter 39. The two leading characters, according to James McKeon, in the final chapters of Genesis are Judah and Joseph. And they are compared since they are both contenders for the special privileges due to the firstborn. Robert Longacre suggests the story about Joseph and Judah is a glimpse into the embryonic nation, with the Judah and Joseph tribes destined to have preeminence in the south and north, respectively. The story about Judah, therefore, is not an intrusion into the story about Joseph, but rather presents a seamless narrative of the providential leading in the characters in Genesis and specifically in the family of Jacob. Providence, to see before. The notion of video, to see, pro, before, a little bit of Latin. And so the notion of providence is to see before. And so we see then in Genesis particularly, the providential hand of God leading in the affairs of the leading characters. Genesis 38 chronicles the story, of course, of this illicit affair with Tamar. And then our story moves along now to Genesis 43. Context: Simeon has been held by Joseph in Egypt. The brothers have returned with their father, to their father with grain, but also a sack of money that Joseph has placed in each of their bags. They're in a strong dilemma as to what to do because Joseph has requested that the youngest brother is brought back. Unknowingly to them, Joseph, of course, knows that that is Benjamin. Now the text here in Genesis 43 reads, Judah said to Israel, his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. For if I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." Judah encourages his father to send Benjamin with him, and he desires to be a pledge of safety for Benjamin, willing, in fact, to be blamed forever. Our very own Lawrence A. Turner acknowledges that there is more than a hint that Judah's character is in the process of change. The final verses for our consideration this morning are in Genesis chapter 44, in what one scholar calls the moral high point of Judah's career. It reads, "Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said," Judah speaking to Joseph, "if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please, let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers." Judah's readiness to sacrifice, to put himself into slavery instead of abandon his brother, is the final turning point in the narrative. So the renowned Old Testament scholar Victor Hamilton suggests a spiritual metamorphosis for the better has taken place in Judah. His speech in chapter 44 represents a profound advancement over his speech about Joseph in Genesis 37. He who once callously engineered the selling of Joseph to strangers out of envy and anger is now willing to become Joseph's slave, so that the rest of his brothers, and especially Benjamin, may be freed and allowed to return to Canaan to rejoin their father. In sum, we see then the transformation in the character of Judah. Let's now look at the passage in Isaiah 11. You recall in the Gospels, Jesus, in Mark particularly, after the temptation narrative, is with the wild beasts. The Gospel writers understood Isaiah 11 verses 1 to 10 as pointing forward to the Messianic, Isaiah at least, saw it as pointing forward to the Messianic kingdom. The Gospel writers look back at Isaiah 11, 1 to 10, and acknowledge that the Messianic kingdom has arrived in the person of Jesus, as he is with the wild animals in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, 12 through to 14. Isaiah 11, 1 to 10 is then our next passage for consideration. Due to time constraints, we won't read the whole passage, but through the family tree of Jesse, David is going to be introduced to the lineage of Messiah. Notice that the reference in Isaiah 11, 1 to 10 is to the line of Jesse, pointing forward then to the coming of a new David. And this David would have the Spirit resting upon him. Notice that the Spirit would impart 7 virtues: wisdom, understanding, knowledge, empower, to equip. And it's fascinating as you think about the 7 qualities the Spirit will impart in Isaiah 11. We see a 7-fold outpouring of the Spirit upon the Lamb in Revelation chapter 5, verse 6. So Revelation 5, verse 6, the Lamb with 7 spirits, is also an allusion to Isaiah 11, verses 1 to 7. This branch, the stump that becomes a branch, becomes, in Isaiah 11, verses 1 to 10, the ideal king. An ideal king prophesied by Isaiah, who is still to come. 700 years down the track, God is faithful to his promise. The Messiah, Jesus, will arrive on the scene of human history. What are the transformations that take place here in Isaiah 11? Well, notice the predators live in peace with their prey, and their carnivorous instincts are transformed. The defenseless in this ancient society, namely children, are able to be free to play with deadly snakes. And notice as well the interesting features about the lion here in Isaiah chapter 11, particularly verses 6 and 7. A young child is able to lead the animals, including the lion, and this lion is transformed because it now eats straw like an ox. Isaiah depicts a future time when God will overcome the curse of sin and establish the Messianic age in which the created order is able to thrive. Pardon me. So there you see on the PowerPoint some of the key changes I have just mentioned. let's head to the finish line this morning. We see then a transformation in both Genesis and Isaiah. We also see something specific that happens to the lion in both Genesis and Isaiah. Judah becomes a pledge of safety for his younger brother Benjamin. Judah, the lion, acts like a lamb in Genesis, ready to give his life in self-sacrifice. The nature of the lion in Isaiah 11, verses 6 and 7, is changed so that a child can lead it and it can eat straw. Notice that the lion undergoes a fundamental change in both Genesis and Isaiah. The lion, in fact, is transformed. The lion, in fact, transforms the lamb into a formidable warrior who triumphs through sacrificial death. From a theological perspective, the Old Testament background of Revelation 5:5 points to moral, eschatological, and creational transformation in the context of our study this morning. These transformations serve the telos of God in bringing about the arrival of Messiah. These various forms of transformation are possible because of the consistency and the power of the character of God. Moral transformation is seen in the Judah narrative, is based on the permissive will of God when an individual comes to realize their shortfalls under the prompting of the Holy Spirit and they enact change. Eschatological transformation, as seen in Isaiah 11, is based on the efficacious will of God, wherein he outlines future redemptive realities based on the eternal covenant. And then creational transformation, as seen in both Genesis and Isaiah, is based in part on the sovereign will of God to re-establish Eden. And so we see moral, eschatological, and creational transformation emerging from our study and dovetailing within the various aspects of the will of God. His sovereign or decretive will, his efficacious will, and then his will to restore everything to Eden. The gospel writers have a foretaste of this with the coming of Messiah. In the context of our study today, God's work in the world is an extension of his character. May God bless us as we continue to fellowship together during the 2023 Newbold Bible Conference.
Thank you very much, Kayle, for those stimulating thoughts. Our next speaker, I suspect, barely needs an introduction because he used to be the pastor here, Dr. Patrick Johnson. Patrick, to introduce him just in case, Patrick gained a qualification in general nursing before taking up theological studies at Newbold College, where he graduated with his MA in religion in 1990. In January 2019, Patrick went on to graduate with a doctorate in theology and ministry from King's College, London, one that was focused on disability and the Adventist Church. Patrick has been a pastor for over 30 years, serving in both Norway and the UK, and currently is the Ministerial Secretary and Discipleship Coordinator for the Trans-European Division. He is the author of a recently published book on the three angels' messages entitled Love Fights Back, 3 Stories to Save the World. Now, when it comes to something surprising about Patrick, I have heard of people running, walking, cycling, roller skating, and skateboarding their way to work. Patrick is the first person I've come across who actually cross-country skied his way to work. Unsurprisingly, this was not whilst traversing the M25, but whilst he was in Norway. The title of Patrick's presentation is Law and the Character of God.
Good morning, everyone. Law and the character of God. And we'll just jump straight into it. Hopefully I get this. Yeah. If you were to, the structure I'm going to use is just 7 points, so I'll be going through them fairly quickly. We're going to look at what is God's character. Then we'll have a look at what is love. Sit on. Yeah? Are you okay? Can you hear okay? Yeah? Good. All right. And then we'll go into what type of law is love. Then the question at the heart of the great controversy, God's solution to the problem of sin, the significance of obedience, and then a couple of implications. So it's quite a bit, but we'll get through it fairly quickly. If you were to think of a text that describes God's character, I think the one you would most likely use would be Exodus 34. You remember the story where Moses is asked to see God's glory. God comes and reveals himself, reveals his glory by telling his name. He passes by and he says this: the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. You know, some have said that this is the Bible's most favorite text about itself because it's repeated most often in the Bible. You'll find parts of this repeated in Numbers, in Nehemiah, in the Psalms, quite a few of the Psalms, in Daniel and in Joel. So this seems to be the ultimate description of God's character. In the New Testament, I think it would be summarized in the words of 1 John 4, God is love. So, that being the case, what is love? Again, if I was to ask you to give me a text that tells you what is love, most of us would most likely give 1 Corinthians 13, and we know the words are there. Love is patient, it's kind, doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it doesn't dishonor others, etc., etc. It's not self-seeking. Notice everything about love is centered on somebody else. It's other-centered. It's looking about the good of the other. That's what love is. It's other-centered. As opposed to what sin would be, which is me-centered. Can you think? Imagine a system where everybody's thinking about everybody else. It's no problem. You don't have to think about yourself because everybody's thinking about you anyway. And you're just passing that on constantly. But the moment one person starts to say, I want it for me, it destroys the whole system, which is what sin does. Sin is self-centered rather than other-centered. Love is also what I would suggest, it's the law of life. God is love, yes. And whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. Whenever we're living in love, we're living in the character, what God is like. And as it says in Romans 8, through Christ, the law of the Spirit of life set me free from the law of sin and death. This law of love is the law of life for the universe, and that's what keeps life going. It's as if God has designed the universe to function in harmony with his own character. You'd expect that, right? That God would create a universe that functions the way he is, which is based on love. It's like love is woven into all the fabric of how the universe is meant to function. In other words, life is only consistent with love. So the opposite, the polar opposite, sin and death, comes from selfishness. Life can only come in a context of love. That's the way God has designed the universe to function. And that's why Jesus says in John 15, if you keep my commands, you remain in my love. You're part of what I am all about, my character. And that's what he did. He remained in his Father's love all of his life. So that being the case, what type of law is love? Now, when you think about the philosophy of law, there are basically only two laws. There is what are known as prescriptive laws. They are generally, you make them up, yes, they're arbitrarily made, with externally imposed penalties attached to them. All the laws that we make up are generally these kind of laws. They are prescriptive, which means then that they're temporary. You can change them when you like, because you're only prescribing penalties to them. For example, the speed limit. You can change the penalty for the speed limit, according to whatever you may want to do as a government. There's no natural consequence generally of driving 35 in a 30 zone. But if the police catch you, you get a penalty prescribed to you. They're prescriptive laws. The other type of law is descriptive. These are those processes that have kind of inherent consequences attached to them. They're part of the way God has designed life to work here on planet Earth. So they're unchangeable. They have intrinsic results to them. For example, the law of gravity. If I was to step off the roof of a 10-story building, I will not go up. It's down. Nobody's going to have to put me to death. Nobody's going to have to put I'm going to have to kill Patrick now because he did that. No. The natural consequence is I will die. Descriptive laws. They describe what the natural consequences will be of breaking them. And actually, it's really interesting because within criminal law, you've got the same two categories. They break them down into two types. So you've got malum in se laws and you've got malum prohibitum. Malum prohibitum means wrong due to being prohibited. In other words, because we've made a law about it, if you break it, that's wrong. Prohibited, yeah? But the malum in se laws are wrong in themselves. In other words, they violate the natural, moral, and public principles of a society. So they're the two types of laws. Malum prohibitum, which are basically prescriptive, and malum in se, which are descriptive laws. So the question comes then, what type of law is love? Is it prescriptive or descriptive? When you break the law of love, is that malum prohibitum or malum in se? And that, I believe, comes to the heart of one of the most fundamental questions in the great controversy. What type of law does God run his universe on? Descriptive laws or prescriptive laws? In other words, are they natural with natural consequences, or does God impose penalties on you if you break his laws? And if we go to Genesis 3, 1-5, I think we see basically what the accusations of God's enemy are. You know the story, so we don't really need to read that again. But you'll notice here, there are basically 4 things that happen. You know, the serpent comes along and says, so did God really put you in this beautiful garden with all these trees and say you cannot touch any of them? That's a pretty random, arbitrary thing to say, isn't it? And of course she says, no, he didn't say that. We can eat any one we like, except that one in the middle. Shouldn't eat it, shouldn't touch it, otherwise we're going to die. Oh, and he says, you won't die. There's no natural consequence from eating from this fruit. How does he know that? Maybe he's touching it. Maybe he even takes a bite and says, see, I'm still alive. There's no natural consequence. Oh, he may put you to death because he's punitive, but there's nothing natural will happen from eating the fruit. And he knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like him. You see, he's selfish. He doesn't want you to be like him. And so the end result is saying that God is untrustworthy. And that's what happens with sin. We start to distrust God. So in other words, what he's trying to insinuate, God's enemy, is that God's laws are like human laws. They're arbitrarily made. You have to police them so that if people do something wrong, then you've got to punish them with externally imposed punishments on them. In other words, God runs his universe on prescriptive law. And it's interesting, Ellen White kind of summarizes this in one way in Patriarchs and Prophets when she says, from the first, the great controversy had been upon the law of God. Satan had sought to prove that God was unjust, that his law was faulty, and that the good of the universe required it to be changed. We shouldn't have his way of doing life. In attacking the law, he aimed to overthrow the authority of its author. In the controversy, it was to be shown whether the divine statutes were defective and subject to change, or perfect and immutable. So really, at the back of all this is the suggestion that if the law can be changed, then God can be changed. And if he won't change, let's get rid of him and put me in place instead, says Satan. But of course, the thing is, God says, like in Malachi 3, I don't change. And so, we've got to make this decision then. This is what's going on in this whole debate. Can we trust God or not? Should we change God out for a different system? Because God is love and he's built the whole system on himself. His law is love. Maybe we should just change him out and put another system in place. And so because distrust now is in the human family, how does God solve the situation? Well, we're told in Genesis 3:15, Jesus is going to come and solve it. And I'd like to suggest that Jesus came to demonstrate that God's system, God's law, is the best way to run the universe by. The law of love, which again, is all about God's character and the way he is. The law of love is the best way to run the whole universe. That's what Jesus came to show. He does it at least in 3 ways. First of all, he keeps God's law all the way through. Remember when he says in John 15, I have obeyed my Father's command and remain in his love. He's shown all through his life, we can, as humans, live according to love all the way through. That's what he came to do. He stayed in God's love. Never once did he do one selfish thing. He stayed within God's love, perfectly obeyed this law of other-centeredness. Second thing, and you see other texts here as well that he's saying, can any of you prove me guilty of sin? And we know he came to deal with the whole sin problem. The second thing he did was to, by his death, to show that the law of sin and death is not something that is arbitrarily placed on us. Remember when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's what it is. Sin means being separated from God. And thirdly, he came to reintroduce trust into the human system. Because he died in trust in his Father. Why have you forsaken me? Okay, I can't see. But Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. I trust you anyway. To his dying breath, he trusted God. See, God made him sin. He treated Jesus like sin so that we could be treated according to the righteousness of God. God left him alone to die. And so I want to just briefly touch on then the significance of obedience. Because, you know, as Adventists, we're really concerned with what it says in Revelation that here are they who keep the commandments of God. Talk to Adventists, the commandments of God are all about the 10 commandments, and that we've got to keep those and we've got to do those well. So what is obedience all about? What is God asking for when he asks us to obey? Well, I'd like to suggest that it's all about developing character. And you could say there are like 3 stages of obedience. The beginning stage of obedience, we get obedience because we help our children through rewards and punishments. When children are young, they don't know the consequences of their choices. So you just tell them, do it because I said so. And I think that's kind of what God did in Exodus 20. When he spoke the 10 commandments to the people, he shook the mountain and it was on fire and people were dead scared. And they said, everything you say, we will do it. Fear and punishment. Yes, reward and punishment is what we do for our children. If you brush your teeth, you will get, etc. A reward. They will do it for the reward, not because they think brushing their teeth is such a wonderful thing. But if you're going to reward, okay. Yeah, that's a very basic way of treating commands. The most basic, fundamental way of getting obedience. But hopefully then you grow in maturity, and then you get to the place where you want to obey in order to please that person. And I think this is expressed by David in Psalm 19. May these words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's better than just being forced to do things through rewards and punishment. Now you want to please the person, but they're not necessarily a part of who you are. There's still an external kind of motivation. I would say the most mature place to come to when it comes to obedience is obeying because I agree with this. Whether it was a law or not, I would do it anyway because it's the best way to live. I think that's what's being described in Ezekiel 36, where God says, I'm going to put my law in your heart to move you to want to do these things. It becomes a part of who you are, part of your character, that you want to just do this naturally anyway. Putting my spirit in you to move you to be like me, basically, is what God is saying. In other words, I think God wants us to move to the place where our obedience isn't about keeping commands in order to earn merit. All the problems we have with people trying to think of, perfectionism, and I've got to do this in order, it would disappear if we understand where God's trying to take us in terms of our character development. Because obedience is never about keeping the rules. That's never what God has ever been intending to do. It's rather about becoming like Him, where love is the rule of our lives, where it's part of who we are. It's part of our character. So a couple of brief implications about all of this. First of all, remember Deuteronomy 6. Moses talking to Israel and saying, Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Get to that place of maturity where that's your natural inclination. And he says, these commands I've given you today. Remember in Deuteronomy 5, he's gone through the 10 Commandments again. And the mantra that's coming through is, please obey these laws. Obey them, obey them. He says, let them be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them all the time. Put them on your doorposts, etc. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your forehead. In other words, even from Israel, God was always trying to transform them into becoming like Him. But there is a sinister side to this, in a sense, because we're told in the book of Revelation that there is coming powers that will try to imitate God's type of obedience. Also about receiving marks on hands and foreheads. It's about how we are obeying. In other words, there is counterfeit obedience. Because what you're seeing in Revelation 13 is a lot of counterfeit of what God's trying to do. There's counterfeit obedience. In other words, what kind of obedience do we actually give God? Let me give you an example. Someone recently made me aware of something called theonomy. I'd never heard of it. Just a couple of weeks ago, they told me about this. Theonomy is based on two Greek words, theos, God, and nomos, which is law, God's law. It's the idea, it's a growing idea within evangelicalism, actually, that civil governments should rule according to God's divine laws. That the 10 Commandments should be enforced. Is that a good idea? If Adventists were the majority here in the UK, if we had 70% of the population, should we start enforcing Sabbath keeping? Is that what we should be doing? Get people to obey God's law? Or would that be more of the false type of obedience? And maybe that tells us that enforcing church discipline may not necessarily be the way God wants us to go. Enforcing compliance perhaps is not God's kind of obedience, but a counterfeit one. There are some implications for this, for us. And one other implication. What should be the main emphasis of the gospel? We talk about the gospel constantly. Generally, there's three ways in which we think about the way it's portrayed. One way that's often portrayed is that we've broken the rules, God's angry with us. So we've got to placate God's anger. He told us not to, and we did, and he's angry. That really is the basis of all heathen worship. Trying to placate an angry God. We've broken the rules and we're in legal trouble. This is a very popular way in which we think about what the gospel is, that Jesus has come to get us out of the legal trouble we're in, because God's got to now impose his penalty of death on us. Again, that is a prescriptive way of thinking about the gospel. I'd like to suggest that the way in which the gospel then would be preached is that we've been deceived by lies. And we've tried all kinds of substitutes for God, and it's just been chaos. And what God's trying to do is win us back to trust in him. Because if we trust in him again, then he can heal all the damage that sin has done to us. He can write his way of doing life, the law of love, into our characters. And then he can grow us to become more and more like him. And then, as Jesus says, then this gospel of the kingdom will be preached as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. If you have questions bubbling away inside you because of what the presenters have said, let me just remind you that the last session of the conference is going to be a panel discussion. So keep those questions to mind and present those later, and hopefully you'll get some satisfying answers. We now come to the break. The Spirit has moved, so we have a slightly longer break than expected, but we're going to be coming back at 10 a.m., 10 o'clock. On your way out, you will see the deacons there prepared to collect your tithes and your offerings. And yes, you'll see a countdown from 5-2, so you know that you need to be here ready in your seats. Thank you.